Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Niambi Carter. Niambi is a fellow with the Wilson Center's Latin American program and an associate professor of political science at Howard University. Dr. Carter is also the author of the book, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. She joins us today to discuss the struggle for racial equality in the U.S. Niambi, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me, John.
So, in thinking about how to begin our discussion, I was thinking about how to characterize the big picture. So I'm going to ask you the big historical question about if you go back to the darkest days of racial America, slavery to segregation, and then fast forward to 2022 and look at that on a continuum, with the goal being this non-racial nirvana that we would, dream is possible someday. Where are we on that continuum in terms of progress?
Yeah, I don't know that being non-racial is the goal. I think the idea is that people can be who they are and inhabit the full humanity of who they are and not have that, count against them in any kind of way.
Right. I meant non-racist. Non-racist is really what I meant. Not
non-racist, not necessarily non-racial, but I get your point, right? I would say we still have a very long way to go. I don't think anyone would say that there have not been improvements, that there's not been progress. I think that's unfair and not true, right? I am not an enslaved person. So absolutely, the quality of my life is better than, say, even my parents who lived through Jim Crow America. Mm-hmm. But we are in a moment where there are attacks on voting rights, where you still have inequities in terms of the ability to build wealth, own homes, look at disparate sentencing, we look at educational opportunities, et cetera. There are a lot of things that closely track with race that I think diminish our march toward progress. And so I think of it not as a straight line, but sort of ebbs and flows, right? Like there are these moments of great promise, like we saw, say, 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Hart-Celler Act, which, reformed our immigration policies. And then you have these moments where we look like we are taking some steps back, like the current moment where we see these attacks on voting rights. I mean, look at what's happened to Nashville, most recently with redistricting. So I would say we still have a very long way to go. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get there, but if we can think between 1865 and 1965 was 100 years, and if we can say between 1965 and 2065, it'll probably be another 100 years before we have perhaps another great moment. And that's if we make it as a nation. I think the prospects look a little grim right now.
This momentum of two steps forward, one step back, it seems to be almost built into human nature when you talk about progress on the micro or the macro level. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what it takes to not slip backwards or not become complacent or to keep the forward momentum going. What does it take for a nation to do that?
I mean, I think one of the things to think about is who are the voices on the margins? Right? What are the voices of the distress saying about what their experience has been? And I think that's one way to not slip backwards. So, when we're talking about election integrity or whatever we want to call it, and people are saying, we have to do this, we have to do this. And people on the margins are saying, actually, the things you're doing make it more difficult for me to exercise my rights as a citizen of this country, then that's a voice we should listen to and maybe rethink sort of our zeal for some of these policies. But I don't know that as a nation, we've ever been really good at listening to the marginalized and the excluded. I don't think we've ever really valued those voices as a way of moving forward. It's sort of like the people who are sort of at the top, maybe, even, not to sound conspiratorial, but like the people, the moneyed interests, et cetera, those are the people who seem to be the most listened to. But I think when we think about progress, whether we're talking about on the environmental front or other places, it's really been the dispossessed who really been at the sort of vanguard of those movements. And I think in this moment, if we want to talk about what moving forward looks like, we need to think about who those communities of care are, and those places that are most in need, usually I think become important incubators for how we can imagine new possibilities.
About that, are we in denial as a nation about the nature of our racism? I mean, that's one theory you hear, that we've never really fully embraced what our crimes against humanity have been in this regard, and then what the embedded infrastructure in place is that continues to keep us in inequality. Do you buy into that theory? Do you think that we just really have never taken a hard look in the mirror and been honest with ourselves?
I would say it was denial if there weren't concerted efforts to keep those conversations from happening. So I think it's not denial rather than sort of an active dodging of that responsibility. Because one of the things that I always tell my students is, when you own your nation, right, and you say this is who we are as a nation, you can't just own the successes and the triumphs. You also own the failures and the missteps. And you have to be very clear that the things that we're talking about, whether we're talking about the Trail of Tears or enslavement or the internment of Japanese Americans in particular, but other Asian groups who kind of got swallowed into that matrix of anti-Asian sentiment, those things don't happen by accident. That was purposeful. That was policy. And so there was a lot of consideration that went into those things. And we can't just say, well, oh, that's not who we are. That absolutely is who we are. But we are also a nation that moved away from the institution of enslavement. We are also a nation that did these sort of great and wonderful things in the arenas of voting rights and other places, civil rights enforcement and expansion of civil rights for, LGBTQ Americans, women, and others. So we are all of these things, and it's a complicated, ugly, messy tale. But to act as if we've only always been, a nation of altruists is just not. It's not true. So I think what we have is not a denial, but just sort of a real disinterest in coming clean. And as your question was, if you don't do that part, right, you can't get through something until you acknowledge sort of what has happened in the real, not just pain, but the consequences and the traumas that come from all of that. That is very much a part of America.
And the fits and starts aspect of this that you described earlier, and you just said now that we pay attention for a while and then we lose attention, and we've seen horrific incidents with murders in the streets that have led to landmark court cases. We've seen that happen and grab the nation's attention for a period, but then it fades into the background. So how do you maintain attention? Is this about the ballot box? Is ultimately a case of electing more people who will stay with this?
I don't think it's just that, because, institutions are built so they don't change rapidly or don't change in ways that we perhaps would most want to see. But I do think, there's a level of empathy that sometimes I feel is lacking, not just in this country, but, globally, that, it's like, why don't you just get over it already? Right? We've done this for 6 months or done this for 9 months. Let's move on. And, people's pain doesn't have a time limit, and certainly doesn't fit you or I's schedule of what is your or my schedule about, sort of what is appropriate timing for your pain and your grief. And I think what we've witnessed with these, the protests over the last few years is collective grieving. I think it's often framed as anger, and it is some of that too. Anger is a righteous emotion to feel. But I think what we're also seeing is people's grief on display. And I think the sort of callous nature of our response to that is really disturbing, because when you do have people who sort of retract from that original commitment, like, oh, I see it, I get it, I understand it, like you saw sort of early on in the pandemic, to it's like, well, what do they want now? It's like, people want justice. And until that comes, you should expect more of this. What we see in the streets is a symptom of these larger problems, not the problem itself. And I think we, as a country, like to get on with things, but we don't ever really do the work to get over things. And so you see these momentary eruptions or these periodic eruptions.
Yeah, that lack of attention span that you describe. I mean, you see any systemic problem always runs into that brick wall. We just want it to be solved quickly. It just seems to be built into our DNA. So When you look at the success stories, and you listed some of them where progress has been made, uh, are there lessons to be learned from those that can be replicated? Are there things that, is what's in the mix that we can string together to see other surges of progress?
I was thinking about this week when we just saw the settlement from the gun manufacturers to the victims of this mass shooting. I believe it was the
Sandy Hook. Yeah.
Of the small children who were murdered really horrifically, and also some of their teachers and others in the school. And one of the things I think about is how long it's been since that event has occurred, and sort of how it really required a sort of sustained effort on the part of the parents and other interested parties. And sometimes there was a lot of fanfare and tension, but many times they were working in obscurity. We didn't hear about this and really until it was all said and done. And I think about a lot of when I tell my students, when we look at the civil rights movement, or we look at the gay rights movement, or we look at any of these sort of social movements, the women's rights movement, they're never complete. And there's a lot of work that happens that is not appealing. It's not heroic. It's a lot of being frustrated and failing and trying again. And that if you really think about movements, the way you see it in a movie, it's all done in 120 minutes. But you're talking about years, decades of sustained activism. And there are times when people aren't interested, and yet you still have these sort of entrepreneurs of the movement who are still working, still striving. And then something happens and it brings more people into the fold. But it's oftentimes just being in the right place at the right time, because there was nothing necessarily magical about 1965, except, right, you have the heels of assassination. You have Lyndon Johnson, who is thinking about a legacy. You have thoughts about next election cycles and who's likely to be part of that Democratic coalition. And lots of factors come together, not to mention hundreds of thousands of people converging on Washington, D.C., applying pressure to the administration. But it's not a straight line to progress. There's a lot of failure. There are a lot of small steps that get made along the way, and you hope, that you get something in the end. But I always tell people, between Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act, that's a decade, mm-hmm. right? And people are still graduating from segregated schools all across this country because of the ways that people sort of do end runs around that piece of jurisprudence. So I just tell people it's a long game. And you have to be in it, because this is a marathon and not a sprint. And social change happens over a very long period of time. And it's almost glacial, right, in some respects, but it's incremental. And we want
to see the changes in our lifetime. We don't want to wait that long.
Exactly. And I don't think anybody wants to wait that long, but I think sometimes we recognize that we may have to wait that long. We may not even see it, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, we think about what activism takes. It takes a lot out of people emotionally and physically. Sometimes people die.
Sacrifice.
Die young, either assassination or just physically giving out from the amount of effort it takes to do that kind of organizing labor. It is a labor of all sorts.
Your analysis about the long-term nature of this, the marathon versus the sprint, makes me think of a lot of what Thurgood Marshall would talk about in terms of mm-hmm. changing the law, the tedium of changing the law, mm-hmm. and it can't just be the big public displays. On the other hand, as you described, there are things that come together. It's not just the technical aspects, the culture changes as well. Mm-hmm. And what are your thoughts on American culture in this moment? We've hinted at this earlier. Is American culture also one of those things that has taken a step backwards?
I'm not sure that American culture ever really changed that much. Right. I mean, because I always think to myself, like, I knew my grandparents and I knew a great grandparent, right? These people who grew up in very different periods of time through the Depression and other things. And I always think that there's somebody else who had a grandparent or a great grandparent who lived through that very same time, who had a perspective and a point of view that may not be something that we relish, but it's real, right? Like, where do all those old races go? They don't just die. They have children, they have communities, they have organizations and legacies too. But even more than that, right? Because I think, boiling this down to like the racists and the non-racists is too simplistic. There are a lot of people who were not themselves actively involved in terrorist organizations, were not actively involved in sort of racist policy making, but were nonetheless willing to be complicit, right, in that system. And where do those people go? And that's what I think about a lot. I think about, Martin Luther King's line about the racial moderates and sort of the danger of the racial moderate. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are now. We have a lot of people who are concerned, right, about where we are politically, but not concerned enough to say, put anything on the line to say, you know what, this is a bridge too far. I may not like these people's politics, but I don't actually want to infringe upon these people's rights to be active participants. That's the bridge too far. And it's going to cost something, right? People have to be willing to put a little bit of their wants and needs and their political capital, quite frankly, on the line for other people. And I think that's what we miss a lot in this country. And I think that's one thing that sort of has, I think, been indicative of American culture is not the people at the extremes. You kind of know what to do with them. It's the people in the middle who sort of observe and see all of these things happening, these injustices happening, but aren't really willing to put any skin in the game or risk their privilege, right, in the parlance of the time. And I think that's sort of where we are. We have a lot of people who are watching, who understand and recognize that there are lots of things that are wrong, but are not willing to do anything to risk their political standing or risk their public standing, even their access to power to say anything. I mean, we have members of Congress, sitting members of Congress, who are just not willing to say that January 6th was wrong. And I don't know how we as a nation move forward when we see something like that, even if we're not the same politically, and say that should never have happened.
When I saw a study about gay marriage that said that the number one determinant on whether or not people change their mind in support of gay marriage was whether they knew a gay person. Mm-hmm. And it makes me think in the terms of what we're talking about. Is America still too segregated in that regard? Is there a lack of knowing each other that leads to, whether it's complacency, not enough motivation, even if you agree that there are injustices, to act, the thing you just talked about now, or maybe even just denial that the problems exist?
I think it's a little bit of all of those things. But even when I think about knowing people, it's not just knowing someone. It's knowing someone intimately. It's actually knowing someone and caring about them and caring about their happiness in their life. And I think about that a lot sometimes when people say, well, is America segregated? Well, yeah, for sure. The neighborhoods we live in, the places where we socialize, but many of us don't live or work in a segregated environment. I mean, we work with other people that look different. We ride transportation, perhaps, with other people who are different. But saying hello to you is different than knowing you on an intimate level, so that I can say, wow, this person is someone that I would consider a friend. Mm-hmm. This is someone that I would consider not just a friend, but someone I would invite to my home. Someone
it can't be superficial, right? It just can't.
Absolutely not. I mean, it has to be some more there. But even in that, sometimes I think when we think about, people say, well, that person's my friend or my acquaintance. It's like, and so what are you willing to do, right, to get that person or to see that person thrive as you are? And I think that's where the hard part is, because justice, freedom, all of those things that we live for, or we say are part of who we are, cost us something. They're not free, right? I mean, it's an act. Democracy is an activity. It's not something you hang on the wall. And I think we have to really acknowledge the fact that this is not a set it and forget it kind of place. It's not a crock pot you turn on and kind of go away. You have to actively engage it at all times. And that means even for people you don't like. And I don't know that we know how to do that part yet, or not even don't agree with.
Right. I want to ask you a question that is in anticipation of something that's going to happen as a final thought. on President Biden has committed to nominating a Black woman to the highest court in the land. Talk to us about the significance of that and what that can mean.
Well, for now, it probably won't mean a whole lot given the balance of power on the court. But I will say representation matters. And when we think about our institutions, just like we think about our representatives, our Supreme Court justices, we would hope that all of those spaces reflect who we are as a nation and where we're going. The country is going to become a majority non-white country, right? And that's going to happen. And so we would imagine that our institutions and our leadership would look like the rest of the country, but it doesn't in most cases, right? And even the Supreme Court. I mean, when we look at the Supreme Court, we've never had an Asian American person on that court of any stripe, right? So whether they were from India or China or Japan, Korea, we've never had an Asian person on the bench, male or female. We can count all the women that have been on the bench, right? We've only had one Latina. We've only had 2 Black people be on the bench, and they were not there at the same time. And, when all this sort of hand wringing about this, the truth is the court is still majority white men, which the court has always been since its inception. And so I think, for people who are used to seeing themselves everywhere, it's almost sort of taken for granted that, well, because we're everywhere, that must mean we're good at this, or we're better at something, or we're more capable, or we're more objective, right? But you don't also think about the fact that being able to see yourself in those places means that you can imagine inhabiting those spaces. And so even though most people won't ever get an opportunity to be a Supreme Court justice, it does matter if you're a kid and you see a jurist that looks like you and you say, oh, I could have a legal career. I could have a legal career of great prominence. In fact, I could be a judge. I don't just have to be a lawyer. When you can see something, you can imagine it as a possibility. And I think sometimes we take for granted, especially when we're probably a member of the majority population, that everybody has that experience. But everybody can't go to the store and buy a Barbie doll that looks like them. It's better now than it used to be. Or everybody doesn't get an opportunity to turn the TV on and expect to see someone that looks like them reading the news, be the president, be a Supreme Court justice, be the House Majority Leader. Wherever you can think of, there is a white face in that room. And most of the time, there is not that same sort of analogous situation for people who are Indigenous and Native American, for people who are Asian American, for people who are Latino, for people who are Black, so on and so forth. So the representation part of this is significant. I also think that it's important to acknowledge that whoever this Black woman is will be as highly skilled as anyone else. And I say that because there's a lot of conversation about meritocracy that we often reserve for minority candidates that we don't necessarily apply to their peers. It's almost assumed that Neil Gorsuch or Amy Coney Barrett or John Roberts or Brett Kavanaugh, that, Justice Breyer, Souter, all of the other, that they were all qualified for this job. We almost spent no time talking about their academic backgrounds, yet we've sort of exhausted the ink on these potential nominees and their intellectual pedigrees, their judicial careers. And that's because we don't often see those kinds of people as deserving. And so I think at least seeing a Black woman in that position, I hope does a little bit to push us to think more broadly about our own presuppositions about who people are, but also to think about what it means for all children and young people to imagine possibility in their lifetimes.
Imagining possibility is, I think, the source of the hope that keeps us going in this struggle, right?
Absolutely.
Niambi Carter, thank you very much for lending your clear-eyed analysis to the nature of the struggle and how far there is to go, but also, giving us some hope with talking about some of the progress that has been made. It's been a great discussion. I appreciate your insights.
Thank you for having me, John. I really appreciate it.
And I would tell everyone to learn more about Niambi's work. You could come to the Wilson Center website or the Howard University website. And that book that you see behind her when she leans a little bit, there it is. That's highly recommended reading as well. Niambi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, John.
Our next guest is Karen Dale. Karen is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at AmeriHealth Caritas. Karen was with us about a year ago to the date, and we talked about her efforts to begin an equity, diversity, and inclusion program at her company. And we welcome her back for an update on how things are going. Karen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A pleasure to see you again. So it was about a year ago, almost to the day that we spoke last, and you were just relatively new to the job that was starting during the pandemic of all times. So give us an update. How are things going?
Oh, they are going well. I am so pleased in terms of how we continue to be on the forefront of change. I'm extremely proud of how we've accelerated progress on our 5 diversity, equity, and inclusion pillars that I shared with you previously. So to recap, I'll tell you each pillar and what has been done in the past 12 months. Pillar 1 is improving the representation of diverse associates across all levels of the organization. We want to do that over the short and the long term. And we've had great engagement. We have 7 associate resource groups that support the professional development of our diverse associates, as well as allies. We often say you don't have to be to belong. And so that opens up room for other associates to join each associate resource group. We've hosted activities to include executive speaker series, professional development seminars, and all types of celebrations to include the identities related to each ARG. And that resulted in more than 2,000 associates participating throughout the year. Pillar 2 is the culture and continuous learning pillar with a focus on building an inclusive culture and supporting the mechanisms to reinforce it. And we know that inclusive companies are twice as likely to meet or exceed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative, and 8 times more likely to achieve better outcomes. So there's a real business imperative for us to focus on this pillar and ensure that we're building a more inclusive environment. We've all heard about the Great Resignation. That adds to the reasons that businesses should focus on building an inclusive environment that supports their efforts to attract and retain top talent and build a high-performing culture. We also hosted our first CEO Day of Understanding, where we had candid conversations with our CEO, Paul Tufano, and me on the importance of inclusion in the workplace. We've provided conscious inclusion training, which we know training alone isn't everything. So we have follow-up discussions with smaller groups in order to really cultivate and give people the tools to help create a more inclusive work environment. Finally, we had a full week of Juneteenth, week of celebration, which offered a broad range of activities, not just for our associates, but for their families as well. In Pillar 3, procurement, oh my goodness, we've done awesome things. We are really focused on strengthening our commitment to diverse suppliers. And the reason for it is really because we know diverse suppliers in our communities increase economic security by hiring locally, by investing in the community. We launched supplier diversity training for leaders so that they are more equipped to engage with and support our supplier diversity goals. We've gone above and beyond by also starting a mentor and protege program for our diverse suppliers. And they have a mentor with our executive leadership, including our CEO, Paul Tufano. So right now we have 10 in the cohort. We also had many leaders who worked across our organization, and their work resulted in a spend of $117 million spent with diverse suppliers. We topped the year off by being recognized by the Eastern Minority Supplier Diversity Council, who selected us as the 2021 National Corporation of the Year. So all good things there.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Very exciting. We were celebrating. Pillar 4 is around health equity. And there we're focused on addressing the social determinants of health that impact health inequity. We are working to broaden awareness inside our walls and outside our walls so that we improve health outcomes in the communities we serve. We have a health equity council that provides forums and speakers. That way we get all of our associates who attend aligned and discussing the relevant health equity topics. We also launched trainings around health equity, bias, sexual orientation, and gender identity, as well as specific training for our provider-facing teams so that they can spread this information and support and expectations with our providers. Finally, pillar number 5 focuses on strategic collaboration so that we are expanding our reach outside our walls and amplifying our DEI messaging through strategic partnerships. Our CEO, Paul, was an early signatory to the CEO Action for Racial Equity, which has really grown in its numbers. Many Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies are part of this. We have a fellow who's been a fellow for more than a year, and they have just put together a really meaningful set of priorities. They have 7 policy solutions, and we've been working hand in hand with them in our markets to help advance the type of legislation, the type of awareness that's needed to focus on improving and addressing some of those issues across our nation that have been systemic and intractable, that are creating more harm for Black and Indigenous people of color. It's so important, these solutions, and I do want to share them with you and your listeners. It's closing the digital divide, addressing cash bail, fines and fees reform. We know there's a lot of work to be done to address the inequities in in the justice system. Addressing early childhood education, expanding economic opportunity through community, development of better and stronger community financial institutions, and a path toward greater food equity. When you think about those 7 policy solutions, it's important to know that without putting in stronger reforms, the damage that has been wreaked by the pandemic is going to push these communities that are already being disadvantaged farther behind. So we are excited to be able to support and actively work on these 7 policy solutions.
Karen, in terms of the impact of the pandemic, has it sped things up or slowed things down?
Oh, the answer is it depends. So in some ways, it certainly sped things up. I think about how quickly decisions were made that helped us to move forward. How quickly we were able to say, let's create sites in communities that helped people to have much easier access to getting a vaccination, right? So we quickly turned places that were used for other purposes into vaccination sites so that communities had easy access. That was awesome. The way we quickly put into place policy change that allowed for telemedicine to occur. We loosened up a lot of requirements that allowed for that to happen so people could get the care they needed that was appropriate from their phone, oftentimes in their home. I don't want to over-index on telemedicine in that we still have work to do to ensure greater broadband access, but we did do a lot of speeding up of things. We did work to ensure that there was more of a focus on collecting information around vaccines by race and ethnicity and language. So that was helpful to inform us about what else we needed to do to improve access and where we had the highest disparities, how we needed to focus our efforts. And we started utilizing more alternative models to advance equity in terms of payment to providers, recognizing that providers who have a patient mix where people have high medical needs in terms of chronic diseases and social risk factors will need to invest more in their workflow and having different people on their team in order to address the whole person and their needs. So lots of good things happened in many ways. What we didn't maybe do as well on in terms of what didn't speed up were addressing the myriad of social factors. The one that concerns me the most is that we know people living in poverty are often living paycheck to paycheck at best. They're more likely to be renters. They were more likely to be on the front lines for a longer period of time, still going to work while COVID was raging. And we know that they often suffered more losses in those communities, right? So they all can speak about someone that died that they know of due to COVID in the early days. And then we know that their children were also disproportionately impacted. So all of those components of their lives are going to fall further behind because in our planning and thinking, we weren't necessarily, I believe, taking as much of an equity lens. We know that these communities are more vulnerable and we're likely to fare less well, right, during this process, the pandemic, but we didn't plan for it, right? So now we're going to be behind in terms of how do we invest enough resources? How do we build on the assets that exist in these communities to improve their opportunity to achieve good health and well-being?
Karen, for a final thought, I want to ask you a question beyond the technical aspects, because what you described in your opening, your answer about the nature of your program, both its focus, its scope, and how organized it is, it sounds like a model for any type of company that might be looking in, whether public or private sector, in the approach. So my question is, what advice would you have for a company that wants to implement a DEI program, and beyond the technicalities, what are the things that have to occur culturally within a company for it to successfully do something like what you've done?
Absolutely. So the first thing is ask yourself why 3 times. When you look at companies that donated money, wrote big checks, had very eloquently written statements, it's fair to ask, did they really create change within their organizations? And so understanding the why is really important. Diversity, equity, and inclusion work is always a journey. And on any journey, you must have a way of being sustained through the journey. So it can't be a check the box. And so if the why isn't really clear, top leadership, CEO, and board buy-in won't happen. The efforts will not be supported and sustained, and it will fail. The interesting thing is there are a lot of people, especially when younger people, when they're looking at organizations as a place to work, they're interviewing the organization. They want to understand, do you really mean it? They want to know, is this going to be a place where I have a sense of belonging and inclusion? Am I going to look around and see diversity embraced and celebrated? And so there's got to be that alignment and buy-in and a clear articulation of the why, so that people see it, they see leaders behaving in a way that is consistent. The second point is that it has to be metric driven and data driven. Can't just say, well, we're doing these efforts. We have to measure, did you make improvement? So if your baseline says that your top leadership, it's this percent of whatever ethnicity, did it grow in diversity over a glide path to 3 or 4 or 5 years? So there's got to be that focus on the metrics, not just saying, well, we did something. Did what you did, does what you do make a difference? And part of that is always getting data from your organization and measuring. It's also important to get different feedback by including your associates in the process. So surveying and getting a baseline on what they see, what they experience is really important. And then resurveying to address that same question, did we make a difference?
Great, terrific advice. Thank you. Congratulations on the success you've had to date, and I hope it continues. And thanks for coming back on and giving us an update on how things are going.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah, my pleasure. Karen Dale of AmeriHealth Caritas, our previous guest, Niambi Carter. I want to thank both of you for being with us today, and thanks to our viewers for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon on. Till then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for being here.